So let's get started. Welcome everybody. I'm very happy that you could find some time to attend the seminar. And on behalf of all of us, especially the Southern California section of the ACS, the American Chemical Society, it's a great pleasure for me to welcome Pamela Leggett-Robinson. Pamela, I will call her because the name is too long, as long as my name also is. So I simplified my name as Krishna, so everybody can pronounce and everybody can follow easily. So I'll call her only Pamela. So I'm going to mention only a couple of aspects that she has her master's degree from Tennessee Technological University in 1994, and she has that is in bioorganic chemistry, and then she switched over to physical organic chemistry, got her PhD from Georgia State University in 2003. I'm not going to narrate all the honors and activities that she is involved with because that will eat away all her time. So I don't want to do that. But I'm being an ACS member, I'm definitely going to mention a couple of points about the services that she has done to both the ACS National Office in Washington, D.C. and her own state section, Georgia section of the ACS. In the mention must be made of her service to the ACS National. She was on the Committee on Education as a committee associate in 2021. She is a selection committee member for the ACS Award for Research at an undergraduate institution starting from 2017 up to date. And she was a member of the Chemistry and Public Affairs Committee 2012 to 14 and an associate committee member of the same Chemistry and Public Affairs Committee 2010 to 11. And amongst her ACS Georgia section positions, alternate counselor 2021 to 23, she was the secretary 2011 to 14, member at large 2014 to 16. She is Minority Affairs Co-Chair 2013 to date, and she is Co-Chair of the Georgia Government Affairs Committee 2011 to 12 and Auburn Section Secretary Treasurer 2006 to 8 and 2004 to 5. So I just wanted to mention this only because it has not been included in the flyer, and I just wanted to pat on my own back for being a member of the ACS. And I could easily see a living example, a shining example of how ACS helps individuals build up on their careers and advance in their careers. So this is a lady, a shining example and a jewel to ACS. And she's going to talk about broadening STEM participation through intentional exposure, encouragement, and engaged support. And without eating into much of her time, I pass on the mic to her. Pamela.
Well, thank you so very much. Thank you. And hopefully I can get this going the way it's supposed to. Me and slides have a really difficult time most days. So I'm going to stop sharing because now I've got to go back and get to the front part. There we go. So yeah, I was going through the slides. So sorry about that. Now I can get back to a regularly scheduled program. And there we go. And then there we go. Can everybody see the slides okay? Great. So thank you so much for that lovely introduction. I was just amazed with the stuff that you mentioned, because now I know really I need to probably send a W-9 to ACS for all the work that I've done, but I want the taxes taken out so I don't have to pay taxes on that. Anyway, so tonight, as he mentioned, I want to talk briefly, well, afternoon for you all. I'm on the East Coast, I'm in Atlanta, want to talk a little bit about broadening participation through intentional exposure, encouragement, and engaged support. So one of the things that I want to do before we actually get into the meat and potatoes is I do want to tell you a little bit about me. Krishna, you were so gracious to talk about my ACS stuff, but I do want to let you know that, yeah, I am a chemist in real life, but I've also been doing this diversity inclusion stuff for a very long time, like actually before it was sexy and everybody thought it was like the thing to do. So much so where when I was in high school, I got detention quite a bit for actually performing chemistry experiments outside of the curriculum. So let me just date myself and tell you, like, I used to take the Bunsen burner and write my name on the table and then light it to just see how fast it would go. And so my mother would always get these calls about, Pamela has done something, could you come get her? And she'd go, oh my God, this girl is chemistry. So it was just destined. What can I tell you? So a little bit about me. Before I was actually a consultant, I did actually do some bench science. But after a while, I decided, maybe I'll just branch out on my own. A couple of things happened in higher ed. And so I opened up my own consulting business. And so I am the founder and executive director. And so what I specialize in, I mean, it's all pretty and nice, but the meat and potatoes, long and short of it, is that I actually help organizations retain and recruit diverse talent. And that means through workforce, program development, evaluation, or program management, or facilitated workshops like this. I love doing what I do, and I always operate from a space that believes broadening participation is actually social equity work. And that's what I mean. Like it wasn't sexy, like when George Floyd and all that, and everybody's getting on the bandwagon. Like I've been doing this for years. My primary research is actually in the area of the intersection of race and gender and the retention of Black women in higher education. Not because I don't think anybody else should be in the space, but that's the positionality that I take because I am a Black woman in STEM. I have been a teacher, I've been a student, I've been a faculty member, and I've also been in leadership. And then in the industry. So these are just some of the things that I've done recently in terms of my publications. And I'm really excited because the last one just came out, I want to say a month ago, and that's a book chapter on inclusive leadership development for engineers. So how we're going to spend our time today, and I'm very cognizant of time. So if you have questions, just jump in and ask the questions. If we start running out of time, then we can hold them off to the end, but I want this to be more of a dialogue. So we're going to talk a little bit about understanding the STEM landscape, because that's vitally important before we even go into thinking about how we can navigate the space and help students navigate the space. We have to understand what the landscape looks like. Then I want to talk about human resources, and I want to think about it from this perspective of personal awareness and the assumptions that we make as people. I also want to think about it in terms of organizational awareness. And the organizational awareness that I really want to focus on is the local section that you're in, because the local section that I'm in had to actually do some real work to figure out where we sat and how we could move forward. And then the last part is really the meat and the potatoes, the building the capacity through the human resources. And here's where we'll spend a good amount of time, but this is not the time where I tell you what to do. These are just some ideas and some things that I want you to keep in the back of your mind about how to move forward, to expose students and higher ed students to STEM, to be encouraging, and then to engage some support. And then we'll do some final thoughts and some wrap ups. So when I do facilitated workshops, a lot of the times I'm talking about things that just really make people uncomfortable. And to be honest with you, like that's the best part of the job. Like I love people's faces going, or like them completely shutting down, because then I know that they're processing, and it takes them a minute to come back into the fold, and they make that shift and that bend in their understanding. So I just simply ask that you stay engaged, that you speak your truth. Like if it's something that you need to say, just say it. Listen for understanding without interrupting someone. You may experience some discomfort in what I say, and that's okay, because these types of conversations aren't to be comfortable. They are to shake it up a little bit so that you can move forward and grow. Because we know anytime there's growth, there's discomfort. And then I also want you to expect and accept non-closure. So there may be some things that you want to do, but you're not sure. That's the non-closure. But those are ways in which you can have more communications with your group. Any questions so far? We good? All right, good. And so I'm going to ask Geneva, if you would mind the chat for me, that would be great, because it's kind of hard for me to do both at the same time. So first things first, let's just really dive into the rationale behind this whole concept of us needing all these STEM jobs. So I love this number, 3.5 million jobs are needed, right? This is the number that the United States will have to fill by 2025, and we're in 2022. So that's really not a lot of people, when you think about it, that are going to be into these STEM fields. And so one of the things that I like best about this slide is back in November, I went to give a talk at a manufacturing company. Now, I'm in higher ed, always been in higher ed, never really understood manufacturing. So I had to do a lot of research on manufacturing. But the thing that I liked most about it was the knowledge that I learned. So I didn't really understand that a STEM workforce actually leads to middle-class jobs. And that is a conversation that we need to really have when we're talking about exposure, when we're talking about engagement, when we're talking about just support. These are middle-class jobs. And especially as we're exposing our students, impoverished students, students that are actually in middle class, these are good starting conversations. Also, these manufacturing and R&D jobs, and most people think that manufacturing and R&D jobs, you're wearing a hard hat, but not necessarily. You can work at the Kia plant and do something totally different, but you're still in STEM manufacturing. And they generate more economic activity than any other sector. Any other sector. For every $1 of domestic manufacturing, it generates $3.60, of economic activity elsewhere in the economy. So when we're trying to get students and we're trying to get our community to rally around why STEM is important, these are great numbers. I love the next one. For every STEM job, there are 3.4 jobs created in non-STEM industries. There's no other sector that comes close to that. So just imagine, you're talking about STEM, we're talking about technology. So even with Zoom, there had to be somebody with cybersecurity, there had to be somebody with graphics, there had to be somebody with communication. All these jobs help the Zoom platform come to life. 3.4 jobs created just because of technology. But in order for these stats to continue, we have to do better about making sure the skilled workforce is there. So I'm sorry, I'm trying to get this thing to do right, and it just never, there we go. I always try to do the enter, and it should be the click. So in thinking about this, we all know that NSF and all these other organizations really just dump money into DEIR programs so that we can increase the pipeline and make sure we have all these students. But we have to realize that there's a historical legacy of racism and marginalization and privilege that actually undermine any new policy or practice within the STEM culture. And so even in thinking about higher ed, they continue to serve as arenas where social inequities and injustices are produced and reproduced by privileging some and marginalizing others. And I've caught a lot of slack for people saying, well, that's not true. But the question then that I have to ask is, so if it's not true, then why do we continue to have programs that fund marginalized students? If everything is the way it should be, then ACS wouldn't have given you money for DEIR. NSF wouldn't have had a big push for racial equity. That's a whole new thing. So they took broader impacts and actually made a whole thing for proposals if these 2 points are not true. So, and you can jump into then why isn't the needle moving? Like, why aren't there more diverse students entering into STEM? And if you want to just speak more broadly, why aren't there more students actually remaining in STEM? If you care to comment, feel free. If not, I'll keep going.
I
Go ahead,
had some
Charlene.
ideas that I worked in the chemical industry. I was a program officer for a year at NSF. I've been teaching in chemistry for 20 years and running a science program, and was the first African-American professor at VCU where I am now. And that's where I got my undergraduate degree. And there were none then. And I've grown up in that environment. Number one, in my opinion, in terms of faculty coming in and surviving, there is a climate, a systemic climate of racism and privilege, and you sit and watch others being embraced while you are left alone to struggle and have things placed in your way. In terms of students, because I run the science major, has at one point had about 700 students. They're looking at television and they're being embraced by healthcare careers. And they're coming in, come on in, and we'll help you to get a degree which we can't give you. And when they fail in that first 2 years of chemistry, biology, natural sciences, and they continue, and we allow them to continue to stay in those tracks until all the monies are gone and they're out. That's what I have to say.
Well, I think, and that was very good, Charlene, and this is a good question. I've taught for many years in high school, biology actually, and sciences, and created a program. Oh, here I am talking about me. I don't want to talk about me. Let's talk about the kids. They're not encouraged to what? I'm going to include everybody. Most kids are not encouraged, regardless of color, to go into the sciences, period. Science, the grade school teachers are not really well schooled in true science, investigative science, discovery. It's more, again, still very rote. Most of it probably has to be because kids need to learn terminology, but they are not doing hands-on activities. They don't have people come in like a Mr. Wizard or any of you who are chemists that can do those magical demonstrations. They are not available. And I really don't know the stats as to which schools in which areas teachers that are schooled like this to go in and teach them or show demonstration. I don't know which schools really get those teachers or not, but most schools don't get them. So science needs to improve in grade school. Science teaching, not science, but science teaching. And at that particular level. And of course, the standards, the national, the new generation science standards, that's national, what I'm thinking, that was, what is established back in the 80s? No, sorry, not 80s. It was after I retired, actually, 2016, 2016, I believe, at NGSS. And then California has its own state standards, and I believe all the other states as well. But science is part of it, but this is at the high school level. It is not, it's still not pervasive K-12. So that's one. Science teaching has to improve, science exposure for all students, because if you start doing that, there'll be more equality in the exposure of students. But here's the other thing. Why is it today that our high school kids, for example, the Hispanics out here in California, Hispanics and the African Americans, that's what I grew up with, so the Blacks, why aren't they encouraged to go on in science research programs, such as the one I created with the Southern California Academy of Sciences? It's called the High School Research Training Program. Well, I called some of the high school principals about why aren't we getting more applicants from your school, like Jefferson High School, John Mann High School, Crenshaw High School out here. And they said, well, the kids who are really bright are pulled in 20 million different directions. Your bright minority kids are. And so there are only a few that are available to do what you might consider motivated and qualified. Well, then why aren't there but one or two? Well, it's because they like and they prefer other subjects, those in the humanities, those in the arts, and those in athletics. And you know, people have to choose what they want to do. Now, it's kind of early, maybe in high school, to even choose, but to have that good background in science really is kind of neat because it could take you in many directions, particularly a bachelor's degree, which is a terrific thing to get. But I think that's still the situation. And even though we have special programs, and I agree with you, why do we still have these programs if people think that everything is equal? They're not equal. They're not equal. We have Asians, including Eastern Asians, Indians, and regular Asians, specifically Chinese Americans. Not even Japanese Americans apply the program that I'm involved in. It's primarily those I mentioned. They apply and they really, really work hard and they come through very, very well. But then again, it's just a few. We're not getting any Hispanics. We're not getting Blacks like we would love to, but it's because early down the way, there's no excitement and understanding comprehension for science, but it isn't just the science, it's math.
Yes.
Can I chip in, Gloria?
Yeah, and when you mentioned OChem, I took OChem too, and I thought, oh no, I had a hard time, you see? And that was not in high school, I was in college. College chemistry, high school chemistry was easy. Math was easy. But you know what? When you get to college, unless you have a real strong background, maybe that's why it was so easy for me. You know, you need a strong background to be successful. And then when other disciplines call to you, then that's where you go, where it's a little bit easier, more fun. You see?
Can I chip in, Gloria, a little bit?
Yes.
I just wanted to put to everybody that, in my opinion, probably starting to stress on the importance of science should originate from the K level, from the elementary level itself, not even the middle school or high school. So probably, if necessary, I can chip in money for pizza and ask even the parents to come over to take some interesting lesson or some advice about how they should encourage their kids to get into science subjects and all that. I want to know Pamela's opinion about this.
Yes.
And maybe
Wait, can I say something, please, just from my own experience and exposure? The people you want to draw in won't attend your meetings.
So as we go on, let's explore that, because I want to talk a little bit about that as we move on. And so as I asked about the barriers, let's think about the landscape. And so everyone made some very valid points about not being motivated. I thought was interesting, not being encouraged or exposed. But I want you to take a step back, and I want you to really think about what the STEM landscape may look like for a historically marginalized student. Because the lens in which you see and the lens from which you speak and why it's important to expose are great. But you got to take a step back and think about, well, what is this 8-year-old Hispanic student seeing, even in the classroom? What are they seeing in comparison to someone from another class or from another school? Are they seeing the fact that it's 3 of them and only 1 or like one can see all the way over, but the short guy can't see anything? Are they seeing that it's a straight line? Yeah, okay, all I got to do is go graduate from high school and go to college, and I can do chemistry, I can do STEM. Do they see it as, oh, this is a yellow brick road, this is going to be fun, this is an adventure? Or do they see it as they have a bicycle and they're trying to carry the bicycle up the rocky mountain while they're still trying to keep their balance? Are they looking at it from a standpoint of, okay, well, I'm in the middle of this road. These people keep telling me that STEM is fun and chemistry is great, but which direction do I take? Or my favorite, you've got 3 students here. One is way high up, and these are the students that you're getting in your program, Gloria. Then you've got the average student here, and then you've got this guy here that's in the dirt. And it doesn't mean, but here's the thing, it doesn't mean that he is not as motivated as this person here.
That's right.
It just may mean his starting point is different. So I really want us to think about what this looks like for marginalized students. So that being said, you all mentioned all these barriers, but I just really want to really find out from everyone on the call, like, which of the following are barriers for students pursuing a STEM degree? Is it the lack of exposure, encouragement, support, role models, access to STEM, or the STEM culture in and of itself? And it's one single choice, just one, but just one. What do you think is like the major barrier? Yeah, I know.
Oh,
I know. And I know there's 14 people on the call, so I can do math.
lack of role models. Oh boy.
I know. Now we're cooking. Now we're cooking.
The answer for me, actually.
Ooh. Couple more people, couple more people. All right, so in the interest of time, we've got about 72% that answered. Oh, we're at 81, trying to give some folks some time. So from the looks of it, the lack of exposure is the main barrier. And we can end the poll now. So the lack of STEM exposure seems to be the one that most people come up with. And the beauty of this poll was that all of these are in fact barriers. But I asked this question, and I'm gonna make this assumption, and I'm gonna make this statement, not assumption. All of these things, lack of exposure, belonging, role models, support, encouragement, access to STEM and STEM capital, all have to do with each of you. All have to do with human resources. So one of the things in my name, you'll see PhD and you'll see comma CAPMs. That means I'm a certified associate of project management. So one of the things that we look at on projects is the human resources, is actually the people that are engaged in the project. You all are the human resources. So actually all of these barriers fall under your purview. I know you wanted to hear that you had more work to do, but that's true. Everything that goes on along these barriers, we have the ability to actually change and work. I know we talked about systemic barriers, and that's a real thing, but systems actually begin with people. So let me say that again. Systems actually begin with people. And so if the systems are out of whack, then we need to reel back and think about ways in which we as individuals can do better amongst the system. Does that make sense to everyone?
Yeah.
So as a evaluator, one of the things that I have to do when people come to me and say, hey, Pamela, I'd like you to evaluate my program, is I have to come up with this lovely logic model. When I tell you, and Charlene, you've seen thousands of these working at NSF, thousands and thousands. When I tell you this is the most fun that I have in doing all the evaluations, because it looks at the ways in which everything is related. And so this is just a quick and dirty logic model for human resources and what actually happens and what the impact of these human resources you all are in your section. So if we think about the input, you all, what are the activities? The activities are actually intentionally creating and fostering a culture of diversity, inclusion, and equity. Those are the activities that you all can do. You all can also create spaces that are open, welcoming, and nurturing to all students. Because we don't want to just say, okay, we want to focus on the Hispanic students. We want to focus on the Black students, the Asian students, the LGBTQ students. No, no, and no. When we're talking about inclusion, we're talking about every single student. And so what does that give us? What is part of that output? Well, the output is having a diverse STEM talent. Those are the students that are going to come and go to college, community college, four-year institutions, graduate school, the workforce. That's your diverse talent. You're also going to see some shifts in perspective. You're going to begin to develop equitable and inclusive practices. You're going to begin to think about ways of intentionally engaging and supporting. And so those are your outputs, but the outcomes are actually just a tad bit more important, because although you have these outputs, what you really want to see is the increase of historically marginalized students participating in undergraduate research, right? Gloria, you want them to be in research, persisting to the next academic level, going from high school to college, having an interest in middle school to high school to college to the workforce. You want them to have some transferable skills once they get to college for graduate school, the workforce. You want students to experience improvements in beliefs about themselves, their attitudes, their behaviors, all these things that will contribute to their persistence and success. You mentioned motivation. These are the things that help motivate them. The STEM professionals that are working with them will experience positive shifts as well in their beliefs and attitudes that contribute. You're going to increase trust between communities and the university, the research capacity, and the relationships that you have with K through 12 schools. Once you have these outputs, you're also going to create community empowerment in STEM. And so the impact of that is my very favorite. You will actually broaden participation in STEM activities at all levels of education and professional levels. And then you'll see a decrease in achievement gaps between historically marginalized students and the dominant culture students in STEM departments. But let's just reel it back a little bit, because you all had a concern with K through 12. So if this goes to plan, you'll be able to see the decrease in achievement gaps. So Gloria, you will be able to see some more motivation for these students. How can you not love a logic model? How do you not love these things? So one of the things that we also need to be aware of is the different barriers. So I talked about the systemic barriers and the personal values and how they actually go hand in hand. So they work in tandem actually to marginalize certain groups. And even in our conversations, you may not be able to hear some of the assumptions, but they're there. And so when we begin to investigate these two constructs, we can then begin to identify their impact on the ways in which STEM is populated, on the ways in which we seek to populate STEM, in the ways that we make assumptions about who should be in STEM. So it may not always be the student with straight A's that needs to be in STEM. It actually could be that student that's at a C level that's very creative and can be in STEM. One of the things that I did as a faculty member, I had an HBCU Up grant from NSF. And one of the things that we did was we took freshmen and put them in the lab to work and not to clean glassware. I had 12 students in my class, that cohort, all 12 of them have advanced degrees and they're in the STEM workforce, all 12, because they started at a place where they didn't have to have a full-blown 4.0. Like we took them at a 2.5. And so these two things, personal awareness and organizational awareness, are the first steps to broadening participation. Personal awareness is also something that we should think of because we're all functions of the systems that we live in. So these systems teach us how to think about ourselves, how to think about others, how to interact with others, and how to actually understand what's expected of us. So each of us grew up in a household where there was a level of expectation, and you knew not to really deviate from the flight plan. But that's just our own system. And so our thought processes and expectations are also based not only on our family, but the type of family that we grew up in. It's based upon our cultural background, our racial and gendered identities. And it's not a bad thing. So let me say that out loud for everybody to hear. Because when we start talking about these types of topics, people think that if you're white, then you're bad. If you're Black, then you're bad. If you're Indian, then you're bad. No, that's just who you are. And it's okay. But understanding that we're born with a specific set of identities that predispose us to unequal roles that allow us to access or deny access to others. And that's just based upon just the reality of where we are. And we have to do better individually, intentionally. But my favorite bullet here is our assumptions of others are also based upon what we see and hear from others, but more so the media. And as scientists, we don't really social media, Twitter, LinkedIn, maybe IG, Snapchat. We don't really do that. But what we do is we read the journals. And sometimes the journals in and of themselves are biased in how we view students. I'll just let that sit for a little while. And so when we think about how we think about ourselves, how we think about others, how we interact with others, it's a self-perpetuating cycle that's complex and often invisible, not to the outside world, but also to ourselves. So how I think about myself, I know that I'm a Black woman coming into a space as a Black woman. How I think about others. So sometimes when I walk into the room, the first thing I do is look around the room to see how many other Black women are there. Not because I'm afraid of who's in the room, but because I just want to know what space I'm in. And then how am I going to interact with other people? Do I need to look a certain way? Do I need to talk a certain way? Am I going to have to do some code switching today? These are all things that run through our students' minds. So when we talk about why they're not motivated, if they're in a space where there are people that look like them and they feel like they belong, then that's why they're there. But more importantly, this self-perpetuating cycle impacts what we assume about others in the STEM space. And I love this part. It's how we also approach our DEIR designs and implement the programs. So it's kind of a double-edged sword, right? So you want someone that understands DEIR, but do they always have to be a person of color? And if they're not a person of color, then how much credence do they give to the space? But then are we overtaxing the people of color to make sure that we teach other folks how to act? And then it's just a double-edged sword. So this perpetuating cycle actually impacts everything that we do. So if you're not sure that you make these assumptions, let's play this game. So I love the show To Tell the Truth, like once again, dating myself. So let me just tell you, I'm going to be 54 in June. So there's the cat's out the bag. So when I was a little girl, was it Milton Berle that used to host the show? I forget who it was. But the premise of the show is you got these three people and you give all this information and you have to figure out who the person is, right? Anthony Anderson has done a great job with a reboot. And so we're going to play this game together. So based on a few pieces of information, these four statements, these four pieces of information, then I want you to answer true or false to the statements following the information. So As a high school student, I was bused to a school outside of my neighborhood. I was a first generation college student. My first semester in college, my GPA was a 0.49, and I failed high school physics. Those are 4 pieces of information. So my question to you is, based upon everything that you know, all your experience, did this student grow up in an impoverished neighborhood? True or false? The student grew up in an impoverished neighborhood. You can put it in the chat. You can just keep it to yourself. We don't have to share right now. The student grew up in a single parent household. True or false? Based upon these 4 statements. The student was able to qualify for a Pell Grant in college. The student was not academically prepared for college. The student struggled in math in college. So I'm really curious, and you can come off mute if you want to, like, what do you think about these statements and how they relate to the 4 pieces of information that you got? So if a student walked in and this is what they had, what would you think? Would you think they grew up in an impoverished neighborhood?
Sometimes it is true, sometimes it is not.
But your first gut, what is it?
I think it is true.
The student grew up in a single parent household. First gut, based upon these 4 statements.
Not necessarily,
Okay.
but one would think so because of the media.
The student was able to, go ahead, Charlene, I'm
No,
sorry.
I'm just saying, when I look at it, I couldn't answer the question as an individual student. I have to answer the question in terms of statistics.
Exactly.
I see.
Good. The student was able to qualify for a Pell Grant in college. The student was not academically prepared for college. The student struggled in math. So let's think about what the answers actually are. Because Charlene, you mentioned that statistics, and Gloria, you mentioned like maybe not, and Krishna, you did the same. And I know there's other people on the call, so please make sure you chime in and take yourself on mute and just jump in. So the person is me. This is all me. These 4 statements have to do with me.
You're successful.
But I didn't grow up in an impoverished neighborhood. I was very affluent. Even though I was bused to a different high school, it wasn't because of affluence. It was based on STEM opportunities.
Right.
I did grow up in a single parent household. My mother was not an unwed mother. She was divorced. So much so, we were so affluent, I did not qualify for a Pell at all. I was not academically prepared for college. That's not true, because actually I had a scholarship to the University of Florida and the University of Michigan. Now, albeit I lost my University of Florida scholarship when I got there because I was doing some other things. One had nothing to do academically with anything else. It was just me having a good time. And the students struggled in math in college. I did not. I failed physics in high school because my physics teacher refused to spend time with the African-American students in class, and she focused on the male students. That's how I ended up failing physics. But my minor in college was physics. My major was chemistry, which is kind of interesting because I failed high school physics. And so I want you just to think about those assumptions that we make. And going back to the statement, Gloria, the media, going back to the statement, Krishna, about true or false, going back to the statement, Charlene, the statistics, going back to the statement about media. We don't, typically academicians don't live on social media like that, but we do live in research. And we have to be careful in what the research looks like. Because when we have a student that comes in and tells us this, we want to fix the student. And the student doesn't need to be fixed. what we need to do is find out what's going on with the student.
Mhm.
And so these are some things that I just want you to think about, because we're almost at time and I need to get through. So what was your visual perception of the student? So as I was reading them, and just think about, like, what student, what did they look like that came into your mind? And was your perception based on personal experiences, data collection, media sources? And then how does this assumption impact your views on student talent? Like, who do you perceive as being successful? Because I'm sure if you asked my physics teacher, she would have never said that I would ever be successful, ever,
Oh.
because of what I look like. She probably would have told you I wasn't motivated either. I just wasn't motivated with her. And then what are the areas of student achievement that you hold in high regard? Is it grades or is it creativity? Because sometimes, depending on the student and the environment and their cultural background, they're very different. And that's where that DEIR comes into play. And then ask yourself, with whom, which high schools students do you prefer to work with or collaborate with? And we all have our own set of biases. So I'm gonna let that simmer with you. And so then lastly, how do your assumptions impact the ways in which you expose, encourage, and support diverse students? And these are questions that, before you begin developing your programs, you have the presentation. I would really like you to spend some time with this. So so I love a TED Talk, right? So one of the things that I heard from a TED Talk from Miss Adichie was that a single story creates stereotypes. And the problem with stereotypes is that it's not that they're untrue, but they're incomplete. They make one story become the only story. And so for STEM academicians and STEM folks in the STEM culture, our story is that students that are impoverished, that are from Title I schools, that don't do well in math, that don't do well in science, won't do well in STEM. That their parents aren't interested, they're not interested, and they're not motivated. So when we assume one story about STEM students, then we're no longer broadening participation or decreasing the opportunity gap. In fact, what we're actually doing is recreating marginalization through deficit thinking. And so as you begin, once again, to develop your programs, I want you to think about that. And so organizational awareness is the second step. And so these are messages that you're surrounded by in your local section. And it's not just your local section, my local section the same way. Like, we have to work to just intentionally get rid of all those ideals and normalizations and perceptions. All of that we have to do. And so as you're thinking about this, begin looking at, what does your local section look like? So who are the students that are served by your local section? What do they look like? Who are the faculty? Who are the industry folks? What does the leadership look like in your section? Right? And those people that work within your section. And then even the membership of your section, like, what type of degrees, how old are they? Where do you hold your meetings? What time do you hold your meetings? What are the topics? What's the location? That's all part of diversity and inclusion. So then how can we use our human resources to ensure justice for all students? And this is one of the pictures, Krishna, from Shireen, and she let me use it. So we have equality, equity, and justice. And so when we think about equality, see, if you notice, they're all in the same step. Equity, we've made sure that that little guy down here is at the same level as the tall guy. But I posit that justice doesn't even look like this. Let's just get rid of the barriers. Let's just make sure that all three can see the game without supports or accommodations, because we've made it fair and equal across the board. And so when we think about our human resources and who we are, we actually create STEM justice. So we do that through engaged support, exposure, and encouragement. And that way, all the barriers are taken down, because we're doing all three of these things as gear shifts all at the same time. And we create a chemistry, a STEM field that encompasses everybody, all different faces, all different ethnicities and races and genders and ableisms, just everything. And to me, this picture of this person is beautiful. It's absolutely beautiful because then I can see justice in STEM. And so when we talk about the ways in which you can do this, and this is how you're going to build capacity. So when we create opportunities for exposure, start networking, not necessarily with K through 12, but you can do it with your college students. You can begin networking. You can do that with junior faculty or people that want to make shifts in their career. Access to labs and industry. Gloria, you talked about this. Make sure these are open, right? And I'm sure you do, but there's ways in which you can make them more open for students, right? Because understanding that with each skill obtained, it helps them develop their STEM identity. It increases their self-efficacy and increases persistence. So even if they don't stay the whole summer, even if you just talk to them about applying, that's exposure. Letters of recommendation. You can't really write a letter of recommendation unless you know the student. Get to know the students that are placed at your door. And it shouldn't be a letter of recommendation that only speaks about the positive. It should speak about what they need to improve and what the opportunity will do to manifest that improvement in them. One of the things that we've done before when I was at the two-year colleges, we had Meet a Scientist Day, or we had a poster session of diverse students, diverse scientists. And what we did for the freshmen in general ed classes, like a intro to biology, they had to do a poster and research a diverse scientist. And the posters were then displayed in the halls of the institution. Can you imagine what that did for students that weren't even STEM majors, but could see the different faces along the walls and see their contributions? It was amazing. It was so amazing. You could even do something like this in classrooms for the teachers, right? They could really think about the ways in which they introduce chemistry in their courses. Informal science learning programs. Once again, an opportunity to get students engaged. We've done some science on Saturdays when I was at Tuskegee, and we had not only the students, we had the parents and the teachers. And people would always ask, this was rural. When I say like backwoods students, but the parents stayed with the students and they participated. And people always ask, how did you get the parents? We just asked them. True story. And they were so happy to learn with their students. So it wasn't about lack of motivation. It wasn't even about lack of resources. No one had asked them. So thinking about that, encouragement. So it's probably the human need to belong is probably the most powerful motivator. And so this really speaks to students already in STEM. And we want to make sure that they're not feeling rejected so that they feel they belong. And then fair access, right? Making sure that we're providing high quality guidance. So even when the students are coming to the labs to work, we want to make sure that there's actual interaction with the students. That is not just about the qualitative measurements, that is actually about the qualitative measurements that they're getting as well. So when you do these programs, I would hope that you would have someone to do a mixed methods so you can see the different ways in which the student grows. And so I'm just going to give a shout out to ACS Georgia section. I think Laurel is on the line, and then Nicole Powell, which is my partner in crime with this. And so one of the ways that we feel to encourage our students is we showcase their achievements, and the Percy Julian award banquet is one of them. And so it's gotten so big that it's no longer just Percy Julian. It's like Percy Julian and St. Elmo Brady, because as an organization, we began to look and see that we also had first generation students that were competing for Percy Julian money. And that was unfair. because they were at two different spaces. So the first generation students, and this was the data that we collected, not saying it's for everyone, they had outside activities, like they had to work. So we actually took into consideration all those factors and made a St. Elmo Brady Award for them. And so if you know anything about the two men, you know who Percy Julian was and all his achievements, but St. Elmo Brady was actually a first generation student. And so all these things build confidence, decreases imposter syndrome, increases STEM identity, and it makes them more self-aware of their STEM pursuits with a growth mindset. So they're not focused on what they can't do. Now we're highlighting what they can do. And it's nice to have people from the section that are at Georgia Tech that say, hey, good job. Look me up when you get there. I'll help mentor you. Engage support. So as I mentioned, I had a program at Tuskegee, and that's me when I was 12 years old. And so we worked with the students, and it really was engaged support. Like, we did not stand back. We literally supported them through engagement. We had students, we had faculty, we had department chairs, and we had deans. Everyone came together to ensure that these students got what they needed to get. We actually had a curriculum designer that made sure that the curriculum went across the grade levels. And so when we talk about engaged support, it provides real world exposure to important concepts. And it doesn't have to be something so big and huge that it takes away from the fun. So as you can see here, we're actually doing chromatography with magic markers. And the students are like, oh my gosh. And that's just for the little types. And then as they got older, we could start looking at the different colors. Then as they got older, we could start looking at the different solvents that they were using. So they kept building, and each semester they came back, or each year they came back, they would move in a grade level and get the same experiment, but have a different perspective. And so these are just all the ways that engagement can take form. You got your partnerships, local sections, K through 12, you got STEM departments, industries, but it needs to be a collaborative effort. So I know we're literally over time, and I'm so sorry, Krishna.
That's okay.
But just a couple of things to consider when we're supporting these students. We have got to augment their voices. I just, instead of telling them what they need, we need to listen and find out what it is they think they need. Because if we come in and tell them what they need, we're the dominant culture once again, and we're telling a community that they're just not good enough. So really augmenting their voices, listening to the students in high school, listening to the students in community college, listening to the teachers, just as like also creating an inclusive environment in the classroom. We have to get to know the community, spend time with them, and that's when you can figure out what they need. For undergraduate research, vitally important, we've got to figure out what research is important to them, what interests the students. And research actually says that historically marginalized students, their interest is aligned to familiar and community issues. So the basic science, they might not really get excited about, but they can get excited about the water in their community. They can get excited about the racial disparities. And you can actually bring in diverse groups into your lab, not only talking about these topics, but maybe talking about why aren't there trees in the inner city? What do trees need to grow? What's not available there? And then you can bring in some data science. You can bring in math. You can bring in all sorts of things, but it should revolve around their community and what's interesting to them, instead of us pushing our research agenda on them. So I'll use myself as an example. Like if I went into schools and was like, okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to talk about glucosinolates and some Cinegreen. We're going to boil some cabbage and we're going to see how this works. And they're like, what? But in actuality, that was one of the research projects that I had at Tuskegee, because prostate cancer and breast cancer were so prevalent, So bringing it home to them and talking about what foods we may be able to eat and why the chemicals react a certain way in their community gave life to some of their interests, because they might have had a mother or a grandmother that had breast cancer. And we did lycopene studies, or a grandfather or father that had prostate cancer. So bringing it home so that it makes sense, and maintaining respect for their diverse perspectives and values, and also ways of doing. It may not be the perfect synthesis with all the arrows for the mechanism going the perfect way, but as I taught organic chemistry, I would remind students, now, yes, you have to have your arrows right, because I don't do that. But if you could show me how this actually works with these reagents, then I'm good. Because that's the creative side, that's the innovative side. And we want to make sure that our students are creative and innovative to science. So in summary, I just want to make sure that we understand that when we think about broadening participation, it's from an innovative perspective, like farm to table, mind to manufacturing, mind to hand, mind to community. We want to keep that in the forefront, but it doesn't happen overnight. It happens one person at a time, one day at a time. We build our human resources the way you would build a building, one day at a time. We got a plan. We acknowledge the impact of our personal assumptions, and then we look for intentional actions of exposure and encouragement and engagement. But we have to acknowledge our personal assumptions first. And I love this Dunning-Kruger effect, because most people are like, oh, I can't do this. And they get a little bit of information and then they get to Mount Stupid. And then things just go all the way left, all the way down. And then you get to the valley of despair. And this is where a lot of people are sitting with DEIR work. Like they thought they had it and then they didn't. But then with wisdom and time and acknowledgement of self, we can grow with wisdom and get to the slope of enlightenment. So final thoughts and next steps, just, thinking about what was your major learning today, what's sitting with you, how are you thinking about broadening participation and decreasing the STEM opportunity gap through your own personal assumptions and organizational awareness? Like, how is that sitting with you? And then your action changes things. That's your next step. So in what ways might you intentionally, individually, and as a section, begin to create and foster a culture of diversity, inclusion, and equity? And then create spaces that are open and welcoming and nurturing to everyone. And so that's my time for this evening. I apologize for going over, but it was good. It was good. And if I could have had another hour, we could have had some really, really in-depth conversation. So I'll take any questions or comments if we have time, Krishna. I have some time.
Yeah. Anybody with any questions? I have myself one question, Pamela.
Mm-hmm.
There are some schools, as all of us know, in every state that cater to only certain segments of people, which are reserved. I will say there's one or two schools here which are predominantly, if not completely, white, 90 or 95%. And when you deal with such schools and all that, how do we make them come into contact with the others of the diverse situations, and let them understand and face that situation, and then they get used to it, and then they can actually accommodate diversity and all that? How do we go about that?
Well, first thing is you can't change their mind. And one thing is to acknowledge the fact that most people like engaging with people that look like them. It's sad but true. And so my advice would be, instead of taking them to the mountain, you bring the mountain to them. So you begin to do these local section activities in which other students are a part of the activities. so that they can then begin to interact. So, so let's say you wanted to do, so let's say you want to do an activity for National Chemistry Week. And it could be, I don't know, maybe they create some chocolate chip cookies using chemistry instructions or whatever, right? And so then you ask them to be the judge, or you ask them to help. And then you pair them with a student that doesn't look like them. You do it subtly, not just over the top. And so it takes time. It takes time to change minds. It takes time. So that's what I would suggest. Instead of pushing them into the space, you bring the space closer to them. Because to be honest with you, Krishna, it has taken, the Georgia section is so much better than where it was when I started in it as the secretary in 2004. It is like night and day, because there were times where I was the only person in the room of color. And there were also times where we didn't have people that would show up at the Minority Affairs Committee meetings or activities. And so we had to really find ways in which to engage them. And so one of the persons that was the most difficult just didn't show up. But now that he is the person that posts everything on the website, he gets to see. He gets to see the students firsthand. He gets to see their accomplishments. And it's changed his perspective in who should actually be in chemistry. And so day by day, day by day, day by day, just be intentional in how you bring the mountain to them. Don't force it. Don't force it. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes. And I don't know, as far as Gloria is concerned, what her male to female ratio is of her students. But I read articles where they say 47% of women folk are in the workforce, but only 20% of them are in the STEM subjects. Jobs related to STEM subjects. And I don't know how to encourage women for, because I'm all for women actually. I can kill for women's sake, definitely. But the problem is how do we encourage them? I want to know what Gloria thinks and what Charlene thinks and what others think, but we need to get this women folk more and more to participate in the STEM subjects and get into the STEM field.
Well, let me just pipe in here. Our research training program has been open to everyone. There's never been any specific focus. In fact, we don't even, well, I designed it so we would not include GPA or any of the classes that the kids are taking, although they have to write a little something in their application that indicates why they're so motivated and very interested in pursuing a position in our research training program, which is free to everybody. Oh no, we charge now, just recently, I'd say in 2017, the Academy started charging $50 to offset the cost of insurance that we have to have for the students and a fee for the annual meeting, which the students have to present their papers and do a poster. Okay, so what's happened is that most of the kids who apply are girls. That's the way it's been.
That's wonderful
and
to
I
hear.
don't know, and it isn't because I've been the lead. It's not that. They don't even know who I am. Well, I guess I write my name Gloria, but anyway, so, but you know, and the name itself is not as well, it's a Latin word for glory, right? But you know, we don't attract many Hispanics. And like I said, that's it. It's mainly the Asian students and white students. And as Krishna mentioned, there are a number of private schools that want their kids in this program, or the kids do, because they know they could get into their Ivy League schools back east. And so they enter our program doing that. Westlake High School and some of the other ones in Pasadena. Yeah, very interesting. So we haven't had any problems with girls.
I
And
see, that's good.
even retaining them. We are an academic year program, 10 months.
Mhm.
You see, this is not a summer program. As a high school teacher, I decided none of this high school and none of this summer stuff. You get in for like 6 weeks and you forget the stuff that you learned.
Mhm.
Something that's prolonged. So I can't help you.
Okay, thank you.
Well, one thing that Linda put in the chat, which I think is great, is she mentioned that having students of color has helped tremendously in getting students across the finish line, or just exposing them. And it does help, and it could actually help with more women. And I think it just depends on the program and where you are. There's some studies that show that, you know, there's not that many women getting into STEM. There's some that show there are not that many Black women, Hispanic men, Black men. It just depends on the study that you're actually pulling from. But what I will say is, regardless of whether or not they get in, it's them staying in that is problematic.
That's
because
right.
the culture of STEM is just a little different. I'll say that.
I understand.
And so, you know, trying to navigate that terrain, as Charlene mentioned a bit earlier, can be difficult at best. And so when you have, as Linda said, tutors that are students of color, it helps on both sides of the coin. So the tutors are actually becoming more aware. Their metacognitive skills are growing, their self-efficacy is growing, but at the same time, the folks that are getting tutored are seeing role models that they can talk to and that they can learn from. And so that may be a way to bring more folks in, but then you have to think about, well, once they're in, then how do we get them to stay? How do we ensure that we treat them well, that they're not in an island by themselves, and that we're making sure that they have a sense of belonging, that they have that STEM identity, that they're not just washing dishes. Good questions, though, and good comments. Thank you, Linda.
Thank you. Well, if there are no further questions, I don't want to keep the people from the East from their dinner. So thank you, Pamela, for a scintillating lecture. And I'm sure we will take it up from here, and we are going to circulate your seminar to everybody, to every local section, not only in our state, but to other states. And we will make sure that your message gets across the country.
Thank you so much. And these are all my contact information, so you can find me. And I look forward to working with you all moving forward.
Thank you.
Thank
very
you.
much. The rest of
All right. All right. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.